Tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon and welcome to the Auckland Art Gallery. My name's Kirsten Lacey and I'm the Director of Toyo Tamaki. It's great to have you with us today. A very big warm welcome, Kate. I'm waving across, I don't know, the digital divide to you right now. It's great to have you with us. This is the 20th year we celebrate the Walters Prize, New Zealand's Contemporary Art Award, and the 10th iteration of the award. And I know we've got a number of artists from this year's award and perhaps some previous ones with us today, so really warm welcome to you as well. Also to the funders of the award, the Congreves, who have been with us from the very beginning, Dame Jenny, who's here as well, as Dale Mace and Chris and Charlotte Swasbrook. Without you, this award would not exist, so we're indebted and grateful to your continued patronage. Of course, the winner of this year's award is going to be announced on Saturday evening. So deliberations are continuing and you'll be hearing about it, no doubt, shortly after that announcement, or early Sunday morning we'll be waking up to learn more about who the award is this year. Our judge this year, Kate Fowle, is going to be in conversation with curator of contemporary art Toyo Tamaki, Natasha Conland, today, and we'll be able to learn a little bit more about what's happening in New York. PS1 MOMA is the institution which Kate is the esteemed director of, and she joins a lineage of great judges who have participated in the Walters. Part of what we are seeking to achieve with the Walters Prize is the exposure of New Zealand artists to gallery directors and curators around the world. And it's a really coveted part of what the Walters Prize achieves for New Zealand art. You're going to see Kate on the screen here, I believe, and slides which she's wanting to share with us today on the larger projection. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Natasha and Kate. At the end of the discussion, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions to Kate. So we're looking forward to what you might want to contribute towards the end of the session. Thanks so much.
All right. Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome everyone to the Auckland Art Gallery, Toyo Tamaki, as Kirsten says. We are going to go live. In fact, we are already live. Hello, Kate. Kate is down here for me, but she's actually up there, so I'm going to do something tricky and wave. And here she is here. Welcome, a very warm welcome, Kate. I'm going to do my best to introduce you here digitally and run through your bio, and I hope not such a static way. Kate, as Kirsten said, is the 2021 Walters Prize judge. However, she does have another large set of responsibilities as the Director of MOMA PS1. And she was appointed to MOMA significantly towards the end of 2019, after 6 years as the inaugural Chief Curator of the Garage Museum in Moscow. And before we go into more details, which we'll tease out over the conversation, some points to notice already. I think Kate responds swiftly to the context that she's in. She's already made suggestions that have improved the way we've been working on this process and driving through, I think, without fail, a very artist-centred focus to her work. So a warm welcome. I think maybe a comment now, so they know you're speaking. Yeah,
it's quite strange for those of you in the audience. I have a Zoom box with a great view behind. You'll see the dusk is with me, and you don't want to see what else is happening in the rest of this room. It looks good from here, but there's 4 boxes, and so I'm going to be able to see you and Natasha and the slides and myself to be able to do this. So it's my first experience, but I wish I was there. I really do. I've never been to New Zealand before, and I was really looking forward to it when I was actually invited to be the judge of the 10th Walters Prize. I was really excited about it. So I hope in the future that I will have the opportunity to be there.
We hope so too. And actually, I had forgotten that we invited you prior to COVID. So we've had already so many iterations of this award. So that we can get to know you a little bit, given you are still remote, a little talking through the bio rather than reading it out, so that you can get a sense of Kate's professional life up until now. Kate actually went to art school rather than other kinds of routes. She's very interested in curatorial practice and has done many talks throughout COVID lockdown on where curatorial practice is now. So she was originally the curator of Tauna Art Gallery and Museum in Eastbourne in East Sussex, before she set up Smith & Fowle, a kind of artist consultancy agency and commissioning body in London, if I've got that right. In 2002, she moved, well, just prior to that, 2001, moved to the US and set up again, chair a kind of a curatorial practice course at California College of the Arts, significantly within an art school, and she was chair of that until 2006, where she moved to Beijing, and in 2007 became the first international curator at the Ulan Center in Beijing. Then moved back to New York, this time in 2009, where she was the executive director of ICI, or the Independent Curators International, which under her directorship was known for setting up the curatorial intensive programs, which were bound to link curators globally and into professional practice and amongst each other generate a kind of a network of thought leadership. And then in 2013, she moved again to Moscow, where she was chief curator of Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, and oversaw its shift into the Garage Museum, into a new building designed by Rem Koolhaas, and oversaw that project, and really the establishment of a new structure for that museum, which we'll get into. Then, and this is really where we're going to start with the now, which is the move back again to MOMA PS1. And of course, 6 months and 10 days later, the museum was shut. So it was a short first stint, Kate. You've also worked with a number of leading artists internationally, John Baldessari, Marcel Bruthers, Urs Fischer, Rashid Johnson, Robert Longo, Anre Sala, Rikrit Tavanija, during your time at Garage. Written about Ilya and Amelia Kabakov, Althea Thalberger, amongst others, and importantly set up publishing programs, including the influential Perspectives on Curating, which our own Terry Smith, I'll just incorporate him, was the author of the first iteration in 2012. But to help situate us now, and after that dramatic an abrupt beginning to your first year at MOMA, can you talk to us a little bit about why you took that role on after so much time really in your curatorial practice, where you're involved in setting up organisations, thinking them through sort of almost like change management in a way, thinking through what their needs were for the 21st century. These were on the whole new organisations that you were looking forward to. And then with MOMA, as you yourself have said, you walked into a legacy organisation and then were met with this kind of tumultuous period has taken you, I would like just first to ask you about the time before that. What were your imperatives when you began? So let's sit before COVID and just think about why you made that shift back to the US.
Yeah. Thank you, Natasha. And can I just see, because I can see the auditorium, it's like, how many people have actually been to PS1 before? Oh, quite a few. Okay.
We've got about 50%, yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So it just helps me in terms of understanding the kind of contextualization that I need to make. So it took me 7 interviews in 9 months to actually get the job. I think that's important to say. For any of you out there that are thinking about becoming a director, it takes a long time to actually get the position as well. That's like, but actually I really valued that process because over that time I was asked to really kind of go quite deep into what I thought was needed for PS1 now. And the now, of course, was before COVID. And so I had to think through ways in which I wanted to lead the institution. And basically, PS1 was founded in 1976. It was the Institute for Art and Urban Resources before that from 1972. And it's a fascinating history we can get into later if you want to. But the affiliation with MOMA started in 2000. And so it's actually, when I started in September 2019, we were just coming up to the 20th anniversary of the relationship with MOMA. And the big question that was put on the table for me as I was talking to people about why they might be interested or I might be interested in the job or in them like giving me the job, the whole question was, what is the relationship between MOMA and PS1 moving into like a new kind of era as a 20-year-old relationship? So what's interesting is that it's kind of another version of the startup situation that I found myself in a number of times and that I love. When I started at ICI, Independent Curators International, that was also started in 1975, but it was going bankrupt. So how could I reinvent it for the time that we're in? And with PS1, you know, whilst there's no bankruptcy or anything like that, it very much is a question of like, what is the relationship between the Museum of Modern Art, a representation and an embodiment of the modernist project and how museums, contemporary museums first started with what was a scrappy, like artist-centered, like non-profit, and what's happened after 20 years of those being together. So that's what was first on the table. And so when I first started, there was a journey that I'd already embarked on in those crazily short 6 months. It was Friday the 13th that we shut down the museum, supposedly for 2 weeks. And then we didn't actually open again until September the 17th of last year. But before that, I had actually embarked on a number of conversations with staff and with board to understand what they thought the institution was, because I think that it's incredibly important to understand the perceptions of people who actually are in proximity to an institution before you even arrive there. So I asked 2 questions of everybody, no matter where you were in the kind of structure of the organization. I met with every staff member one-on-one for half an hour, from security up to the deputy director. And I asked them what they thought the core values of PS1 was. I asked the board this as well. And then I asked them what advice they would give me as a new director walking in terms of what I needed to look out for and what some of the things are that are kind of in their mind urgent to address. So that was very interesting, the results of that as a kind of starting point pre-COVID. And actually what came out has meant that although there have been many shifts during COVID, what I perceive to be some of the urgencies of the time for PS1 in relation to what I was hearing from staff and board and stakeholders actually was not dissimilar to what it is that we're doing now. It's just become like 17 hours a day rather than 8, and it's some things have become more urgent. So
Just prior to arriving at PS1 as well, you had begun sort of a discussion of something called the Reflexive Museum. Were you able to transition some of those ideas into those early conversations, or were you really genuinely waiting to hear back from these conversations about how to feed into that process? What I've noticed in the way you describe your role is you're often questioning who you're serving. In fact, in the very first conversation we had, you said, how can we serve artists better? And to an extent, when you start at PS1, it feels to me through these conversations, you're saying to staff and to stakeholders, how can PS1 serve you better? Do you want to talk a little bit about that concept of the reflexive museum and whether that was informative for your process there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I found that, one of the reasons that I was interested in the opportunity of leading PS1 in this time was that I've lived in the United States, or I'm a US citizen now. It's been my home for 20 years, and I've lived elsewhere during that time, and I've been thinking through many kind of eyes and ears, but I was really interested in having the opportunity to work at what I would call at home, even though it's not my original home. And I say this because of the fact that the whole thinking through ideas of reflexivity happened whilst I was working at Garage, but it's through an accumulation of trying to understand what kind of structures and strategies need to be put in place for an institution that can actually serve artists and can actually be relevant to the way in which artists are thinking, wanting to work, what it is that they want a museum to do, how audiences, how various communities can kind of think of it more as a place that their perspectives and their ideas can actually shift and make a difference. And the whole notion of reflexivity started because of basically from 2016, I guess. There are a number of key thinkers in sociology who are thinking about reflexive modernity and the fact that in this moment right now, it's kind of crazy to start thinking about post-modernity because the hospitals, the prisons, the school systems, all of the structures that were put up to take care of the masses and create the kind of social structure, the civic structure that modernity gave to us haven't disappeared. It's just that there are now ways in which they are crumbling or not necessarily serving the ways in which people want to be thinking, living, working. And so through Arab Spring, for example, through a lot of the kind of movements that happened around 2008 forwards, particularly 12, 13, 14, there's this way in which there are alternative ways of thinking through what modernity could, how we want modernity to serve us. And reflexivity is a way of, it's kind of reflexive. It doesn't mean just being reflexive or reflective on how you're working for yourself. It also means a kind of more collective kind of reflexivity about the societies that we live in and that we inhabit, and how we want to create other types of structures within it through conversation and through analyzing what is actually happening. And so this is why when you ask the question, Natasha, it's did you already have this in mind, or did you truly want to hear what people wanted to say? Actually, what's built into thinking about a reflexive institution is that you need to speak to others, and there's a kind of reflexivity that needs to happen in the process as to how you actually. So by putting that at the kind of center of the way that I was thinking about how to develop the institution, it was kind of inbuilt that I needed to understand where people felt the institution was at in the first place.
Right. And so...
Does that make
yeah,
a bit heady?
I do. Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And what you're saying is it's a kind of a toolkit that is mobile, right? So in our most recent and shocking set of changes, the shock that, in fact, closing the doors of a museum or a gallery wasn't, in fact, in the control of the museum or the gallery, perhaps the greatest shock of all, that a museum perhaps wasn't an essential service to the community in this kind of global pandemic that we're still living in. How did you use those conversations also to help you through the economic impacts? You've talked about how PS1 also took a hit, and in fact, we have heard here, of course, of really ongoing changes to the New York art world in terms of gallery closures, rent crises, etc.
So the PS1 that I took on was an $11 million budget. It had 63 people working. It had 22 board members. It had a board structure that basically didn't have any committees that is more traditional within board structures, i.e. it was more of a board that gave money but didn't necessarily understand how the organization worked. And the programming at PS1 was increasingly what I would call a festival culture. So there were 200,000 people a year that came to PS1. 50% of those came for warm-up, which is the 20-year-old music program that we do in the summer, and the New York Art Book Fair. So, like, if you think about it, like, people are coming to something that they really like, but they're not necessarily coming back, because if we've had 200,000 people for like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, it means that they're not coming to something else, because you could count them 2 or 3 times if they came back. So that was the kind of structure. Going through COVID, by the time we reopened on September the 17th, I had lost 18 staff completely, as in they were laid off, and we were $4 million shorter on the budget. But I had a board, and in particular, 7 people who constitute what we call a core working group, who would spend every week talking, learning, understanding what the institution was. And so there was a way in which there had been something gained, because we had together started to understand what the institution was, where the problems were, why we were like beyond COVID. Because COVID, I had this visual memory so many times. It's like you open the cupboard, the skeletons fall out, and then they catch COVID and they crumble. And it's just like, but there are always skeletons in a cupboard of an institution. And so it's like, it's not that the problem was just COVID. It's the problem that COVID like amplified what were already the problems there. Mm-hmm. At one stage, we went down to 17 staff. We had to furlough 47 people. And that meeting people one-on-one to tell them that they had to go to the unemployment line was one of the worst weeks of my life, because it is this kind of helpless. It's not from choice. And the selection of who the 17 are that stay to try and run an organization for 4 months. And we didn't know at the time it was 4 months, but you know, that's one of those situations where I hope that future directors don't have to go through it.
Yes. Just shifting back now from that moment, because we need to return to the now by the end, I think, and probably lift ourselves in tone and spirit.
Yes. I'm still smiling.
Yeah. No, they're good. You talk very much about your curatorial work as being a child of the 1990s and the global imperatives that were born through that period. The biennial decade, the growth and expansion of the travelling curator, and then some of those formative roles that you've had through ICI and in particular at Garage, which was building an international museum for a locality that was in relative terms closed off to that global market, were about instituting those conditions. But looking more specifically at Garage, and you can talk us through the structure of Garage as by way of introduction, but some of the gestures that you set up behind the scenes, I'm thinking in particular the archive project at the Garage Art Museum, have had lasting effects for the locality. Can you talk about just that mindset when you stepped in the doors of Garage and seeing what the audience was then and where it was when you left it?
Mhm. Maybe to take a step back to kind of explain that kind of 1990s aspect. It's like I learned a lot by being in China in terms of generations. And I would say that while there are many people who were part of that first movement in the 1990s, where there were curators that were traveling and developing exhibitions all over the world in emerging art centers that were basically using the kind of biennial festival structure as a way to amplify what was happening, I was never actually involved in that. As in, like, I've just turned 50 rather than being 55.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a kind of difference in terms of the wave of the people that first started doing that. There's a woman who some of you may have met called Zoe Butt, who is now working in Vietnam at the factory. And through a conversation with her, it's very interesting. There's a way of understanding that the first wave, if you like, of responses to globalization through this biennial type structures is that there is a lot of activity happening in a place for a short amount of time where artists from that place get put onto a platform in parallel with like people who are kind of coming through. And we had long discussions about how important it is to actually kind of shift that dynamic and how to understand that the locality of a place is extremely important and how there needs to be infrastructure and conversations that develop there that are connected internationally, rather than it just being a kind of platform where everybody rushes to, enjoys an exhibition and then leaves again and the local environment remains kind of local. It's like, how do you actually build discourse that starts from the local and moves outwards? So that was very much the way that I was thinking about the work that I did at Garage. And I was the only person that didn't speak Russian in the organization. And that means that I was actually the only person that wasn't from Russia immediately, initially. And when I started working there were 80 people. And when I finished working there, or when I left to take on the job at PS1, there were over 300 people. The average age of the staff remains around 26 or 27. And what you are looking at is a post-Soviet generation who are building an institution in the way that they want to have their futures, their children, their grandparents, their parents. It's like they're building something that is inherently what they want to go to. And that's a very, very different way of working. And it's an incredible opportunity to, if you like, not have to be subservient to, not have to always take responsibility for the birth of the 20th century Museum of Modern Art, or the ways in which the 19th century institution, the museum structure of modernity, is something that we're always having to kind of look to and unravel, if you like, but the structure's already there. When we were starting to build Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, we could choose where we wanted to start that narrative, because the rupture of communism, the rupture of what happened during the Soviet era, basically meant that the connectivity from the modern structures that were started so brilliantly by artists at the beginning of the 20th century had become kind of untethered, and we could start to understand what it is that we wanted to be doing there. So you can ask me in any direction from there. Do you want me to go into the archive now? Or?
I think maybe for first step, maybe it's important also to talk about the structure of Garage. You've described it as a publicly minded, privately funded museum. And in a way, it has a connection also to a new breed globally of contemporary art museums, which are set up privately to do a job globally, perhaps for a locality. And yet this museum has another purpose also, right, which is your definition of how it could be publicly minded, which is something quite different to the State Museum in this context. Will you make a very interesting point in that regard?
Mhm. So I spent a long time trying to work out because of course, the first thing is like, oh my God, you're working for Russian billionaires building a museum. It's just like, what is going on? You've always worked in the public realm. And um, I think it's very, very important to understand nuance because as we do like create these kind of connectivities, it's very easy to create the lowest common denominator of how you understand each situation. And basically in Moscow, and in Russia, it's like Garage was the first contemporary art museum. And the word museum is very important. We need to talk about that in relation to the archive. But it was the very first contemporary art museum that did work in a way that was towards a public. And the difference between traditionally what happens like in the public realm under a kind of Soviet system that is like state run, state owned, it's like civic space isn't necessarily the same as public. And that was very, very important to start to make this difference because the work that was actually happening at Garage in terms of establishing education programs, inclusion programs, did not happen in any state institution. And now it's starting, but Garage was the first to actually develop that kind of thinking. And the use of the word museum in this context was very, very important because when I first started, it was called Garage Centre for Contemporary Culture, CCC. And through conversations with various publics, it was decided that the word museum, particularly in Russian, because there is no word for contemporary art. It's many actual art. It's the art of now. Otherwise, the word always gets translated into modern. Mm-hmm. And this doesn't work, nor does the word center. It seems like a club. And so it's actually more elitist in Russian than the word museum, which is so traditional within the culture, which, as you know, is so rich that the word museum. And so the question was, what is a contemporary museum? And how do you start to get in the Russian language, a conversation around the contemporary museum being the actual museum, the museum of actual art, of now, of people actually being kind of live. So the way that I looked at that was like, Garage Museum of Contemporary Art is a place where people, art, and ideas make history. So what is it to create a museum that can actually be built around the creation of making history together, the making of art, the bringing together ideas? And so that's why the archive became the collection, because there is no art collection at Garage. But the archive is the evidence, if you like, of the work of artists who were underground from the 50s through to the 90s, where there was the explosion into like being able to make at least performances and make exhibitions temporarily. But it's like, how do you, if you have an archive at the heart of a museum, basically what you're doing is you're saying at the heart of an institution has to be the evidence of stuff that has happened, even if you don't have the works themselves, because they've all gone abroad and all been dispersed or been destroyed.
Right. And what sort of scale is the archive? And I got the sense when I heard you talking about it previously that the archive could also capture social and political movements as well as artistic practice.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know, I think there's around 750,000 pieces of paper, videos, objects. The way that it started is actually before Garage. So there was a woman called Sasha Obakova, who runs the archive now, who in the early 90s started working for the Soros Foundation. The Soros Foundation was in Russia for 2 years and then backed out because it was too complicated in the early 90s during the perestroika period and all the turmoil going on there. So Sasha and a group of artists continued to collect every flyer, every leaflet, every video, anything possible of all the stuff that was emerging from the underground scene at that time. And raised money to try and do things in various ways. And then it got to the stage that by 2010, it was basically under her and other artists' beds. By Garage paying literally creating a position and paying for that archive to be preserved and expanded, it was, a very important gesture for all the artists that have basically paved the way for somewhere like Garage to be able to exist. Then what happened was that there were a number of artists and collectors of that period. And bear in mind, collectors in Russia, what we're talking about is a lift operator is one of the key collectors of the underground art movement. There is nobody who has large collections that you go and visit. Often when people from overseas they come to Moscow, like from 2014, 15 onwards, they're like, oh, we'd love to, like, we want our group to go and visit like the best collectors' collections, as you do in other places. Like, that doesn't happen. There isn't that kind of display between people. So collectors are different. And so there's been an accumulation of a number of archives, but then what happened is it went too far. So there are a number of people in St. Petersburg, in Vladivostok, in a number of different kind of centers in Russia that also wanted to put these archives together. And it was agreed between us that it's a bad idea to accumulate into one place. And so then we started a network called the Russian Art Archive Network, whereby it was possible for us to be able to support like the evolution of archives that could be in different places in the country, and also the digitization of archives that are sometimes quite incredible, often in Germany, of stuff that academics or artists or people don't get access to in Moscow if you can't travel to go and see the archives that basically tell other parts of the story that have been taken out of the country during the Soviet Union.
So the archive had a dual purpose. Its physical nature was very important for the actual functioning of histories on display. And also it was a sense of cohering a lost history. And in addition, I've heard you talk about the imperative of the digitization project and the publishing project, which is significant for engaging international audiences in that history, and in a way, linking contemporaneity in Russia to the world. Is that fair?
Carry on.
I was just saying, is that fair that you also had that mission to send, sort of engage other centres in this history?
Yeah, it's a two-pronged process. There was when we opened the new building, what is now, if you were to go to Moscow, Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Gorky Park, we did this project called the Family Tree of Russian Contemporary Art, which is ongoing in different formations. And it started about a year beforehand, because there is there are a very small number of places that artists based in Russia, Russian contemporary artists, whichever way you want to say it, and there is a difference, have opportunities to be able to present work. My question to people who know way more than I do, which are the curators, all of, again, who are young, Sasha's the oldest, is like, how do we determine which artists should be given shows before another? It's like, what's actually happened out there? So we started off working with sociologists, with art historians. Remember that art historians in Russia actually became the art critics, because if you wanted to actually talk about underground art and what wasn't the kind of formal art or the Soviet realism, then you couldn't work in universities. So gathering these people together for a sequence of conversations and artists to try and understand what the lineage is. And it became a bush rather than a tree. And what happens is that it's all about stories and accounting. And as we all know, when you tell a story, you tend to put yourself and your colleagues and your peers in the center of it, because that's where you were when it happened. So it became really, really important to find evidence, not to prove people wrong, but to start to understand when artists are kind of jettisoned onto a world stage or given opportunities to make larger scale exhibitions. It's like, what is the context? They don't come out of nowhere, but often the work that they made historically has disappeared, or it never even existed in an exhibition format. It existed in the album format. So it was important to build it in that way. And then it's important to speak from the place that this all happened internationally, because there's an awful lot of people that say from other places in the world what happened in Russia. But what is it that people, especially younger voices who are doing all this research, when can they actually speak from the place through their experience of being part of this kind of inability to really connect intergenerationally? How do they start to speak for themselves?
Right, and you've spoken a lot about that importance of linking generations and also engaging a new generation in that history and then pushing things forward. I'm sensing now that back in New York, a different kind of almost country of its own right, that there's a sense that some of those missions and imperatives of connectivity have also locked into addressing the local. And I'm just wanting to ask you a question around, what does a locally responsive New York City look like? Or is it a location that you're also applying the same kind of generative impulse towards? And is that in opposition to some of the previous thinking you've been doing around global connectivity, or is it a supplement, a conduit?
No, it's actually a flow. It's continuing through because, what's interesting about New York is that it has a lot of bravado. It has a lot of histories, again, kind of written about it, but it's like, it's as provincial as the next place, if not more. And so pre-COVID, there was already a way in which, that we are in a school building. The P and the S stands for public school, and it's number one because Long Island City used to be separate from the kind of greater New York area. And so it's the number one school in this separate city called Long Island City. And then as it evolved, so everybody in New York knows what PS1 actually means, but other people don't. It's like, and through the relationship with MOMA and the increasing kind of internationalization of the program, the specificity of being in Long Island City, which when PS1 first opened, it was an industrial neighborhood that had 7,000 people living in it. What I inherited in 2019 is the fastest growing residential neighborhood in the United States. Right. And there's more than 170,000 people who are now living there. What you're watching in terms of the skyline is crazy. It's like, it's developer's paradise. And so what I started to understand is that if we were able to backtrack time, PS1 is this kind of still center of something. If you could do one of those like time-lapse films from like 1976 to now, it's the thing that stayed still with everything else moving around it. And yet the placeness of the place has kind of become untethered because it's this festival culture where you kind of turn up and then go away again. So what about making PS1 a home? Because it's always been the place where artists can experiment. It's been nimble. It's experimental in like ways outside of just exhibition making. So I wanted to kind of bring it home in two respects, both to its founding principles, because that's what I was hearing from a lot of people that like is the perception of PS1, whether you've been there or not, the perception of PS1 is that it is this kind of artist place. So, what better for a vision than to actually like make the place what people think it is in the first place? Because whilst it's become untethered, how about bringing it back to that?
Yeah, I was really fascinated in your response there because just reflecting on change and even the sort of dramatic tone of the latest art forum, which says we demand change in museum culture now. More or less this is how Tim Griffin starts. There's a sense that the world is in change, but we're not. But what is change, right? There's a sense that if what has become most noticeable, in fact, are the structures that are not changing. And your reaction to that has been, in fact, to bed in rather than to assert more difference, to bed into some of those long lines of continuity set up by Alana Heiss and differently by Klaus Biesenbach, second director. You're the third only director, and you're about to open another Greater New York. It's a kind of celebration of a principle to an extent, is it?
Yes. So what's interesting about Greater New York is that, I mean, it's a year late because of COVID. So it's Greater New York 6 years after the last one. They're usually every 5 years. And actually, the exhibition started in 2000 as the very first kind of manifestation of the new affiliation between MOMA and PS1. So it's always included curators from MOMA and from PS1. And this year, we've also invited Moses Saraburi as a curator who is independent of both institutions to work like as a foursome with us. So there's one curator who's the head of the Cisneros Institute at MoMA. There's Ruba, who is the lead curator at PS1, and then there's me just interfering with things. So the way that we've been thinking, obviously doing studio visits during COVID has been hell. It did put me in good practice to do the Walters Prize. Because, you know, most of them have been remote. But a lot of the thinking that I was doing even before, what I was thinking about when I was starting to kind of put together how I wanted to shift PS1 whilst remaining cognizant of some of the key things that are important to artists about it, is that Greater New York happens every 5 years. It has a bunch of artists that run around all over the place, find out what's hot and what's not, put it on display, and then like lots of things happen because the curators are really good at doing what they're doing. But like my thinking is, why doesn't PS1 celebrate like artists in New York every day, every week? So how can we take Greater New York, the exhibition, and turn it into a program that runs continuously through PS1? So how can we make the 20th anniversary, which is now the 21st anniversary, you know, a moment whereby the exhibition happens, there's a reason to celebrate, because there really is, as we start to get back up on our feet and as artists start to, I mean, it's very, very different working with artists now in terms of their, the support that they need. But then what are the kind of tentacles that can start to come out from that so that Greater New York doesn't disappear in 5 months' time, but that it's the seed for the ways in which we base the kind of principles of how we work with artists moving forward, at least locally. The other thing is about, I mean, Long Island City is in Queens, and Queens is the most diverse population of New York, and some argue the country, all sorts of arguments. It's like some say like hip hop started there, others say it was the Bronx. But what's interesting about thinking about internationality and how to integrate it, I think for me, one of the biggest shifts that we need to be thinking about is where that starts. The kind of what Mi Wong Kwon used to call like the kind of like fly in, fly out, the kind of itinerancy, what we understood in the 1990s of people going and kind of like the kind of anthropologist as curator or the artist as the kind of traveler. It's like, it for me, it's so important to create the kind of networks between emerging voices that are all over the world, but embedding it in the ways in which there are also emerging voices in your own locality. Thinking about, rather than multiculturalism of the 1990s, thinking about the relationship of immigration, emigration, diaspora is a word that is coming back in again, in terms of like, I'm hearing younger generations using it, which is interesting to me. But how you start to create these threads or networks that are much more about discourse and sharing ideas rather than this kind of like fly in, fly out international programming.
Is there something also more here that you'd like to say about art that's being made in New York post-COVID? You've touched on it. I'm just thinking about what you'll be picking up through the project of Greater New York and your program post-COVID, and the weighty social, political and economic changes. It's easy for us to use those terms, but have they substantively impacted on how artists are responding to the climate that they're in? Have you noticed tangible differences in your conversations in the way that artists want to see their work? Or are some of those standard principles that you've talked about, that you workshopped during your time at ICI, about developing a flexible organisation that can lead with the artist's voice? Have they remained intact?
So I need to go back to 9/11
Yes.
and kind of go forward from there, just very briefly, because what's interesting is that, at the moment there's like the city of New York. It's just like, Greater New York is actually a very good term in relation to the city, because it's like New Yorkers wins, New York is back, New York is brave, New York is this. It's just like, what the hell is this all about? But it comes out of a kind of resilience that is the native New Yorkers, and the new New Yorkers ways of believing that New York has to be. And across the country, there was a ricochet from 9/11. And I remember being in LA in kind of opening season in September. It must have been 2012. And there were a couple of artists who were starting to make a commentary within their work, but it took really 2 or 3 years for any works to deal directly with what was the trauma of that moment. Fast forward to COVID, we could go to some other places as well, but fast forward to COVID, the fundamental difference is that rather than it being the trauma of the way in which, of a kind of like more international scenario that kind of plays out in terms of how the world divides with like interest around who did what, COVID has happened to every individual, no matter what. And COVID has impacted so directly the ability for artists financially, in terms of space, in terms of mental health, in terms of support networks, the remoteness that people have felt. Often there are people who live kind of tenuous lives. What connects them is going to an opening or going to an event, and they could go back to their like bed that's like basically in the cupboard of a friend's house if they can just get enough money to be able to make it. It's like when COVID hits, that impacts people so directly that it's a very, very different situation. And I think that what's happening now is that there really does need to be a kind of shift into thinking more about how Greater New York is looking at this, how we can learn from people who have gone through these experiences of remoteness or have been overlooked or who have been kind of erased at different times, which is what a lot of younger artists are feeling. How can we look to our elders to understand people who have been doing this for years and have been overlooked themselves? How can we shift the structure so that the work, of course, is important, but how can we start to try and financially, physically, mentally support people or practitioners in different ways? What is actually needed? How do we do that? It's like, so there's been a lot of thinking through that, which, we will stumble in some places, not in others. We've started to open up studio spaces within PS1's building for artists, thinking very differently about how we divide the money up. There's only 47 artists in this Greater New York. There was 150 in the last one. It's only taking 2 floors of exhibition space, but there's a large amount of programming that's happening around it. And there's more money that's going into artists' hands to try and just make the work because they literally cannot. So, I think it's shifting from the work, which, all of us want and love, but it's shifting from that into like, what is the way that we take care of each other so that we can actually do what it is that we need to do?
Yes, it was interesting. Recently we had an address from our former Prime Minister on the what to next on the state of the arts, and she called to mind the government's policy on wellbeing and applying that structurally and in our calls. And I noticed that oftentimes when you have been talking about art today, you're also talking about a kind of sustaining a cultural well-being, which is quite affected in real terms in the way you've made decisions to sort of flatbed the hierarchy in a sense of the new MOMA PS1 and think about, well, if this artist talked to the curator, how would they do their work differently? But also how would the doorman do it differently? How would the programmer, how would the conservator, etc.? So ensuring that the dialogue happens across the organisation.
And it's not easy, but it is the work that has to be done.
Yeah.
And so that's why 17-hour days is the imperative right now, because to actually to work, the commitment to work like that, not just on my, but on the team that I'm working with, is huge.
Yes. I have more questions, as you know, but I'm conscious there are some good people here that have their own thoughts, and they've heard some sort of like teasers of a whole range of really fascinating experiences. I'm going to ask now if there's someone from the audience that has a question for Kate. I feel like we have to move quickly because we've had such a good run of digital success. So I'm anxious not to
But
get
I have to say, I do love the fact that, true to form, even if the speaker isn't on the stage, people like don't fill the first 2 rows.
I know, it is true. And if you'd come here, you know, it's a tactical device in our culture too. Jenny, you've got a question. Would you mind just using the mic? Because then Kate can hear you. Thank you, Jenny.
Is that on? Yeah.
I can hear you. Yeah.
You can hear?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Given that, you know, COVID has caused a rethink about how we communicate everything, basically, in the arts, we've all become accustomed to having our meetings or meetings like this, with Zoom and so on. We've even had to learn how to judge art prizes digitally. And I mean, auction houses have all gone online and so on. I wonder if you think that reliance on technology is going to linger on after COVID, when we're all back to so-called real life. You know, will it have an ongoing effect, do you think?
I would say absolutely, as the short answer to that. What I think is important is understanding the flexibility of connectivity if there's a commitment to want to connect. I think what we've seen during this, it's like there's many downsides with not being able to like physically touch people, hug people, or just like feel in proximity to people. It's like, you know, humans need that. But there is a way in which we can start to introduce different modalities of how we do actually connect and make choices so that we can actually connect people quite differently. You know, I do love the idea of being, when I was working at ICI years ago, it's like, I was seen as quite audacious at thinking that we could use Skype to try and do some meetings between curators all over the world because we couldn't afford to bring everybody together. And it's like, oh, the time difference would be too difficult, or this, that, and the other. That hasn't been the case during COVID because the urgency has been to try and connect, to try and communicate. And so I think that we need to add it into our toolbox, and we need to add it into a way. But the fundamental issue, whether you're in person or whether you're distanced, is the commitment to actually want to connect. And I think that that's been made clear. It's just like, it's very hard for a screen, but it's also very hard if you're in an environment that you don't feel safe or comfortable in with a whole bunch of people around you. A prize situation is one of those as well. It's like, how do you make people feel comfortable to be able to actually connect and talk to each other? Is that like a good enough answer? Have I answered what it was that you were trying to?
Yeah, I think so. There might be some curiosity about evaluating work online, but I'm not sure if you want to comment on that, Kate.
I'm happy to. If somebody wants, if people want to know that, I'm happy to talk about my perspective on it.
Yeah, why don't you talk your perspective on it? Because it connects very fundamentally. Because when we had that critical question, would you proceed? You were very clear that you would and were confident in that decision. I'm guessing because you knew you could do your job effectively in that context remotely.
So I think that, again, my confidence in it is that I believe that we can't just give up with these things. And if the principle is bring somebody who hasn't had the opportunity to see the work to engage with it, then that's the principle. What we did do as is shift the process. So I spent a lot of time reading. It was incredible what the gallery, what Natasha, what Lizzie, what the team at the gallery did to actually enable me to move around. It's like I literally had the space to myself with a cameraman, at some stage also like a second camera. Lizzie, although she's taller than me, became the person that could give me the physical relationship between things. I kept asking her, can you go and stand over there? Can you sit there? Can you move over there? Can you put your hand up to this, so that I could see scale? And the camera was also, I was asking the camera to like go in really close or go back. I was trying to use the camera as if it was my eyes. It's like, what's behind there? What's in that corner? Even if it wasn't to do with the art, just so that I could try and understand. And of course, it's not like being in the space, but it's, you know, it was extremely helpful. And then we added in this extra layer because I said, I really need to be able to talk to the artists, because to be so remote from the work and then not have the opportunity to talk to the artists, to ask them questions after I'd seen the work, to get more, to kind of be more inhabited by them and their way of being, the way that they speak, the way that there's a kind of language to art that does come out of the hands and the minds that make it. And so it's, for me, it was really, really important. And I'm very grateful that we were able to kind of shift the way that the judging worked so that I had the chance to spend time with each of the artists. So that it kind of changes the way in which you see work. It's like, it's not just seeing with your eyes. It's like, it's using all the senses to be able to try and using the brain in a different way to try and inhabit a space that you can't physically be in.
What was really beautiful about that too, I think, Kate, is you inhabited your natural curatorial impulse. When you see a work that you are excited by, your natural impulse is to want to step into the next level of meeting the artist, but you knew you would get there straight away. So you said, well, actually, I'm going to set this up in advance. Yeah, thank you for that. I think we've had some really positive responses to your conversations, and that is part of this, the dialogue that we're involved in with the prize, albeit we're not hopeful of a precedent for remote judging in an ongoing way. Does somebody have another question they'd like?
To come still.
Does somebody have another question for Kate? I know we've got some students of curatorial practice. At least I hope they haven't gone to their next class in the room.
One running away.
Some who will have read your book or Terry's book on perspectives on curating. I'm just going to wait because I know our audiences emerge slowly with questions. No? Oh, Sarah?
Kia ora, Kate. I guess one of the questions I had was, in judging the prize remotely, you're not coming to New Zealand, you're not being immersed in New Zealand culture in the same way. And I guess all of the ways in which, you know, you're talking about a kind of multi-sensory experience of place and of understanding a place and a people and the work and context. I wondered if you could talk about that and how you decided to navigate that with this prize.
Now that's a really good and important question, because that's the bit that I think both Natasha and I were most concerned about. And me in particular, was it's like, I do not like, I mean, one, I don't like the word judge. It's like, can we change that with all of these types of things? It's like, the term is something that isn't conducive to a certain way of thinking. And absolutely, to not be able to inhabit the spaces, but also to not understand the context. And then, like, as in the context of Auckland, and then the context of the culture, the social and political, like, now moment. You know, it's just like, there's nothing that can replace that. And that's why I lived in Moscow and I lived in China, and you know, it's like, because you can't start working in places and like making decisions about what needs to happen without actually like the use of language. It's like the rhythms that people use, the kinds of modalities of sociality, like how an argument starts, what triggers things. It's like, that's all really, really important. And that's why I have had to take a different kind of approach to thinking about what judging the Walters Prize means, because I don't feel equipped to actually necessarily understand the context. What I can do is I can work really hard to give to the artists my impressions from my own perspective. The ways that I can, by trying to read the context that they are making that work in, by trying to read the way it is that they're trying to communicate, it's these kinds of leaps of faith. It's just like, so how have I started to understand the context that they might be working with from this remoteness? Like, how can I add a layer of kind of understanding, not because of the fact that I think it's more important, but what can I give to this situation? Because there needs to be something that I can give to it rather than actually judge it, especially remotely. Does that make sense?
I think it's a good question, and I appreciate your response and sensitivity to that. I think Jenny and Eric and Robin in particular here will know too, through the history of the judging, it's very hard to get the commitment to make the travel to be here in person, and it's a pressured time. And I think intuitively you're putting in this extra time in conversation is part and parcel of a principle with which you operate. And I think certainly we've had a lot more preparatory conversations than I've ever had with a Walters Prize judge before. And certainly, as you know, and I don't think it's a secret, that it's not been a principle of the prize for the judge to meet the artist in advance. So you've fostered a mechanism. And of course, we're open to ask the artists all kinds of questions regarding the context within which they're working. And I understand you felt equally regretful that you were not able to come as a result of those meetings. I'm just going to say
I said yes to the prize,
meeting
I was
exceptional artists.
But when I said yes to this opportunity, it was way before COVID.
Yes.
It was one of the first things that I was invited to do in September, October time in 19, because it was going to be happening. So it's like I said yes to coming.
Yes.
And then, I could try and come, but I don't think you'd let me in.
No, that's right. We can't even let our own in at the moment. I think people are probably getting close to needing lunch, and the windows outside are telling me that it's getting to nighttime now. Kate, I want to thank you. This is our last sort of official interaction as part of the process here. I know we'll see you again on Saturday night, some of us, and you will be doing a few media stories post-Saturday night that talk about the process perhaps. But listen, the warmest thanks to you and your participation. It's been really something to hear from you today. Very generous offering of your history and progress, and also where you'd like to go to next.
Thank you. It's been amazing getting to know you in this way. I am looking forward to giving you a hug sometime.
Yes, yeah. We'll see you in MIQ facility.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, from all of us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, thank you very much. I think that we've proven that technology can connect us a little. For those of you who will take thoughts away with you, we'll hear more from you, but today, let's conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.